I'm
Did
good.
I give you one?
I'm good. I printed the, email version.
She hasn't memorized.
I'll just stand. I will be standing. I just forgot.
I like this resolution is celebrating the expansion. Woo-hoo, did we bring hats? Party favors and snacks. Jen, did you bring snacks and party favors for celebrating the expansion of the in-person voting?
We are celebrating and we don't have any snacks.
Well,
That's a shame.
party hats? Party favors? Anything? Nothing? What, then it's not a celebration. If you don't have cookies, how can it be a celebration?
We're up. Let me know when you're. Oh, I didn't know what time you were.
As soon as Brian stops talking. No, go ahead. All right, we're live. We were just live 5 minutes ago. TMI, Jen, TMI.
It's hard to soar like an eagle when you're surrounded by turkeys.
Speaking of turkeys, I had 15 turkeys walk through my backyard this last week.
Wow.
It was like two families.
Thanksgiving's coming.
We oftentimes will see, one adult and 6 or 7 or 8 of the younger ones. They're not babies anymore. All of a sudden, my whole yard is filled, and they start coming up toward the house. I thought we were getting invaded by turkeys. I was telling Brian through my backyard this week. We were watching out the backyard, and probably had like 15 turkeys walk through.
I believe that.
Yeah, I've seen oftentimes, families of 7 or 8 or something like that, but all of a sudden Carla's like, there's like 15 turkeys out there.
It's probably 8 or 9 years ago, but I pulled out onto Jackson Drive, and I'm not kidding. There was like a herd, so to speak.
Really?
And I never saw turkeys fly before, but they saw the car coming. They all flew into the trees.
I've heard you got to watch out because they try to fly, but they don't get
Right.
off the ground very fast, and all of a sudden, bam, you get a
Right.
windshield full of turkey.
Oh, exactly. I was kind of going slow. Just the whole flock.
It's not like they're streamlined like
No.
blackbirds or doves or something.
And they're not exactly. They're kind of mean birds. They aren't really. Saw one in our backyard pecking away at a bunny one day. Just pecking away.
Really?
Yeah.
You have to set a trap out and back for catching one of them for my Thanksgiving dinner.
Bow and arrow.
Huh?
Bow and arrow. Who do you? Odd topic, okay, but the urinals here, you need a splash thing in them.
Okay, we are going live. Please make sure you're.
I'm serious, they could. But I don't know who to talk to.
No more urinal.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Being 7:34 p.m., I will call to order the Special Village Board meeting for Tuesday, September 24th, 2024. Roll call is taken. We do have one member that is excused, and we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Item number 3 would be any village citizen to comment on an agenda item. Anybody sign in? Thank you. Item number 4 is the Financial Management Plan Workshop number 2, Governmental Funds Plan. And this evening we have Mr. Raymer with us from Ellers. Welcome.
Thank you. This needs to be green, right? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Also, Ariana Schmidt is with me as well from Ellers. So we have the bulk of the financial management plan, the heavier workshop here tonight. So I am going to try to move through this quickly, but we're going to walk through what I just handed out to each of you before we started the meeting. So the one thing I want to make sure everybody remembers is tonight's element is looking at the initial draft budget. So there are other opportunities to make changes. This is not final recommendations. This is the understanding of initial reaction on our end, and how the village can look at this from kind of maybe a 5,000-foot view, and as you start to move into, your 1-foot view, as you go through the budget process. So through tonight's meeting and then kind of moving that forward, again, the whole point of the financial management plan is kind of review the financial trends, illustrate, these impacts that we see with the numbers that we receive, general assessment of strengths and challenges, and then hopefully provide a framework for your decision-making as you go through the budget process. So first we'll start with the historical trends, strengths, weaknesses. Financial positives slide I'm on. This is slide number 4. The general fund unassigned fund balance as of the end of the year for 2023, so your last fiscal year results, you did increase from 64% of op revenues to 66%. This is good. You're ultimately at a very strong rating when we look at the credit rating profile of the village, most recently with the 2024 borrow. So overall, that's good news. That gives you flexibility in terms of what do we do with these funds, which we'll kind of talk about later. Then for net new construction, we had a very good year, 4.1, almost 4.2%, which we'll kind of get into how levy limits are affected by that. But that is the primary driver of the allowable adjustment for your base levy. So that results in a buying power for that base levy of $173,229. In addition to that, we received, if you remember, the CMA payment, not the Country Music Awards, but the supplemental county municipal aid last year. So we gained something. We didn't gain another one this year, but nothing was taken away. So that is good news. Obviously, these are things that we don't always control. So your shared revenue and then kind of remaining consistent, and the net new construction provides some levy limit capacity. I believe that CMA payment, which is tied to your or the state's sales tax, and all municipalities receive a penny of that budget from the state within that. I believe that went up by a couple %. So for the village, it's not the gain of the 200,000 some that it was, or I forget the exact dollar amount, but you're not gaining. It doesn't double on itself. It just goes up by the increased sales tax revenue. So it's a small adjustment, but again, the message is nothing kind of taken away. Just think of it more or less consistent. Then on the next slide, looking at financial challenges, levy limits, and how net new construction is tied into that. It's just a representation that you don't get to make kind of unilateral decisions on what your levy needs are. Ultimately, you have an allowable levy limitation. You have to operate within that framework. We'll dive very deep into that. The 5-year average is about 2.5%. Which is pretty good when you compare yourselves to the county at about 1.8%. So again, good news. We had a very good year last year for new builds, which is now your 1/1/24 values, which is giving you your net new construction for the allowable levy limitations. The other challenge would be general obligation borrowing capacity. Just a representation that we're not only limited in terms of operating revenues were limited as well as to how much we can borrow, which ultimately is a good thing. There should be, controls placed there. But again, that's actually limited beyond that point when we think about trying to achieve a credit rating and not wanting to go fully to that limitation. So if you forgot from last year what that limitation is, it is 5% of your total equalized value with the TIDs included. So total equalized value of the village, you get 5% of that. That's the total limitation. You're currently at about 37% of that limitation. We talked in detail about that with the first workshop. On the next slide, which is labeled levy limits at a glance, this is just to identify how levy limits work. So there's a statutory limitation to how much you can levy. Generally, what that is kind of in the orange box. The formula is, what did we levy last year net of debt? So you remove your debt adjustment from last year. You add the percentage of net new construction, and that's your minimum allowable base, what we call base levy. It's your pre-adjustment levy amount. This is imperative to know because you often want to think of that as this should fund operations unless we're having net new construction problems. And sometimes you need to seek out these other adjustments to get there. But just on its face, upon receipt of that worksheet every year, this is line 8, and it's a very important number because it'll identify how much can we levy. And if we think of that as the only object that we have, in terms of funding, as the majority source of revenue funding our operations, can be an important number to track. Then you are allowed, as the final line says in the orange box, to add whatever's needed for debt. So you're limited as to how much principal outstanding, but technically the state allows an infinite debt payment each year, which is kind of weird to think about, but at the end of the day, you can claim what you need for debt service. So then on the next slide, this is, awesome, cool. Historical EV and net new construction. So I think last year, someone, I apologize, I can't remember which trustee, but someone asked for the county data on there too. So we wanted to provide kind of an updated chart, not just kind of taking the DOR's chart. So we're combining a couple of charts from the DOR here. The total EV is the blue bars, orange line is the village net new construction, green line is the county as a whole net new construction. So you're definitely making up the majority of the good things going on in the county. So that's really good news, specifically, just looking at the last 3 years. If you look at how much the village's net new construction is versus the county as a whole, which you're a part of course. So. Any questions on kind of where you guys have been with that? I know it's just looking a little different from what you saw last year from the chart perspective. Okay. The one thing I'll point out before we go on is these are not things that are guaranteed. There's obviously still new construction going on across the street, all over the building actually. But these are things that are not always guaranteed. You can have all the permits in the world pulled, but actually the building's not, completed. So these are hard things to predict and always say, it's going great, it's gonna keep going in that same direction. The one thing I'll acknowledge there is there can be significant drops, i.e. 09 to 10, right? Obviously there's significant economic events going on there. Not to say that those won't happen again, we also can't predict them. But the point being is when we start to project in the future, we are gonna use a level of conservatism to identify what if the bad years happen in a year and what kind of financial pressure would that put on the budget process. So just understand when we start to talk about our future projections, what we're actually grabbing for that is something more in line with the worst years from '09 to 2024 that the village has experienced. So this isn't me predicting doomsday. This is me identifying, putting a financial stress test on future budgets, not the '25 budget, but the future ones. So I just wanted to point that out so we don't have to flip back to it later. But you're going to see a 0.5 or a lower net new construction number, and kind of I wanted to highlight it here because it is highlighted on this chart. So then to identify what does net new construction mean? That's a fun little percentage number. We do like to quantify that to buying power towards your budget, meaning what can we increase our levy by and fund our $4 million operation that we have going on and providing all the wonderful services that we do to our constituents. So you can kind of see the around 2.5% to 2% is $70,000 to $100,000, with a very good year last year of 4.1, providing $173,000. However, this is providing that funding for a $4 million operation. So you really think about that, really only allowing for about a $2 million or a 2% increase. The other element of that is fast growth requires fast reaction, capital expenditures, new hires, which is going to be a highlight of this presentation. So the state allows it for that reason, a recognition. What we're finding though is 2% isn't CPI, right? So we got to pay our existing employees, and we got to figure out wiggle room to hire new people as well. So it is really good news, but you're almost required to have that good news every year, and we'll kind of walk through the numbers as to why I say that. Questions on net new construction and kind of how that works for your allowable levy?
I will just bring up, if there's any burning questions, do trump me. Seeing none. The other side of the coin, when it comes to how you're thinking about the levy, it's an unfair concept, but it is reality in that, let's say our expenses are able to somehow freeze in time or hold, but if we're reliant upon or backing into a levy based upon revenues that are also acting in a non-beneficial way, or they're decreasing, we are now up against two issues where we're trying to not increase our expenses, but we actually need to decrease them in a way that compensates for revenue. And so when we're talking about state shared revenue and then being willing to index, a 2% lift on sales tax, that's helpful. But in areas where you'll see in October, there are certainly other revenues we used to be able to rely upon in ways that alleviated our levy needs that you're going to see significantly decreased in this iteration. And so I wanted to bring it up now so you understand a levy is what we can't offset for ourselves and how we're delivering services. One big breadwinner is our building permit fee revenue. That does bring in quite a bit of money.
So then to take a look at history in terms of where the levy need has been, this chart moves chronologically left to right, but and what you're seeing is levy year. So, what they'll call your tax bill year, you're going to receive a 2024 tax bill this year, but that supplies the village's 2025 budget. So understand how this chart is built. This is going through all of the years to last year's budget, right? Starting with 19 to 20, we show what the levy need was. So we know your actual levy dollars. We look at your historical budgets to identify what it was levied for, and can kind of see the actions within the budget process each year, what built our levy need, which actually ends up being your actual levy. So don't confuse that this was a request and the actual levy was something different. This actually happened. Then we look at what the tax rate and tax bill was for that year. And this is tax rate only for the village. We thoroughly understand you have a county, a school, and a tech college. We don't work for all of those entities, so we're not going to say that we can change the minds on how that full tax bill is built. But we're speaking only to what the members up here control, and that is the village's tax rate and then corresponding tax bill. And then we're showing that on a sample property value starting in, and we pulled a real property. So starting in 19 tax bill year at $231,900, that's $7.99 tax rate yielded an $1,852.96 tax bill. Does that make sense in terms of how we're kind of showing this chart? Because I'm going to repeat it for the 25 budget and the planning in the future. Okay. So then historically, the one element I'll mention is you can see that the levy need grows each year, but for the 22 budget to the 23 budget. So those are just kind of things that will kind of continue to show throughout. Those are things that you always want to kind of track as to what the levy need is. The other element that I'll identify there is your assessments change partially because of new growth, that's added tax base, that's good news, but also partially as a part of revaluations, which one did happen for the 21 tax bill. As you can see, this property value changed in that year from 2020's assessment where there were $231,900 value property to a $298,500. So the tax rate dropped, but the tax bill increased also partially because of a levy increase as well. But you have to understand that there are three components at play into how these things are controlled and maneuvered. And then kind of similarly, you see that in 22, the assessment remains the same, but the levy need dropped, and then we had a corresponding, due to the assessment kind of remaining the same, slightly higher, new value added, that we had a tax bill drop. So important to kind of understand how those three interplay, and understanding that we'll be kind of navigating this future projection throughout. We can't change what's happening on the screen here. I'm also not pointing it out for woulda, coulda, shoulda. I'm pointing it out for understanding of how we build the future slides. So let's get into it. The 2025 budget. I need Cobra to build these. You got sound effects, and I know this is less exciting. So again, you saw on the last chart how the levy component is built, but you have general and operating funds that are supported by the levy. Those, think about, are primarily subject to levy limits. Of course, we could claim adjustments to potentially add to our allowable levy. Those are quite limited for operating funds. So generally, just think of it, those are subject to levy limits. We'll talk about how we build those funds budgets later. For the capital program, those are technically subject to levy limits as well, because unlike debt service, you can't just say, hey, we got a $100,000 truck that we want to put in the storage shed. We're going to levy for that. There's no adjustment for capital. Now, like last year and other years that you saw on the last slide, there is a line item where there is a capital levy. The village has made decisions to be able to fit the capital levy within their allowable levy, whether that's through the base levy or the debt adjustment. So last year we used the debt adjustment to get to the $184,000 capital levy, and then that downsized the debt issue that we issued this year. But technically, there's no allowable adjustment for the capital levy, but that tends to be then our movable object as we face tough decisions for allowable levy. Finally, then GO debt service, not subject to levy limits. Like I said, we can go up to an infinite amount of annual debt service subject to the total principal outstanding limitation. So then on the next slide, looking at how the general and operating funds are kind of built understanding how do we get to these levy needs. You want to look at your non-levy revenue sources. Generally for municipalities, we're holding those flat, meaning can't always predict our building permit revenue, can't always predict what our dog licenses will go for. But these are also small components of the pie. The largest components usually are, utility pilots and the state shared revenues. So that said, we generally hold these flat outside of any known adjustments. I kept the CMA state aid payment from last year in there just as an example. That's not changing as a completely known new add there. We're adding it by a couple of percent based off of the state's estimate that they have out there now. So non-levy revenue sources held flat. We have one piece of the equation. Now we have to look at our expenditures. So the department heads go through and give wonderful presentations about what their expenditure budgets will be. That expenditure budget solved against your non-levy revenues gives you now the final piece, which is what we're solving for, the levy need. So we have to plug for a balanced budget to get to our levy need. We weigh that then against what is our allowable levy. For example, this year we get to add 173,000 to what we did last year. And we look at how does our levy need meet our allowable levy. So looking at the next slide for the 25 budget, and then I have last year's budget in there as well, and categorically shown general fund, rec, fire, capital, and debt service. Remember, capital is something that we that's our movable object. We decide that later. So right now, there's no, staff request for capital. It's something that we explore through this process. We want to focus on the operating funds first, and then debt service. So the levy need last year was about 5.7 million, almost 5.8 million. Looking at the initial draft budget, line by line, about a $200,000 increase to general fund, 30,000 for rec, 100,000 for fire. Capital should not be showing an increase. That's an odd result. And then this is all wrong. What's going on there? I think it's grabbing a wrong cell there. I apologize. However, it's about a $200,000 increase, slightly under. That is weird. Anyway, we can calculate that because the difference there is about 200,000 for the general fund, 3,000 for rec, and 30,000 for fire. So apologize that last column is connecting to something different there. So now we have our levy need, right, of 5.9 million. We want to weigh that against our allowable levy. So then looking at the levy limit worksheet, which we have a blank one now in front of us at the staff level. Again, remember that line 8, which is essentially what did we do last year plus net new construction, that gives us our base levy. So right now that's, and as shown in the top right, 4.2 million and change, so 4,267,404. You can add in the debt service adjustment, which we're just saying right now that would be 1-to-1 to your debt service payment for next year. So from the last slide, the 1.65 number, we're looking at what that debt service adjustment would be. So we have a known total allowable levy of 5.922. We have a projected levy need of 5.964, 356. So we have a slight deficit in terms of base allowable levy to our to our levy need of about $42,000. Now, there are various options to meet those needs. There are the allowable adjustments to increase the allowable levy, meaning there's an additional debt service adjustment that can be made. There is other non-levy revenues if you have those available, or of course, expense cuts. And then Jen, I don't know if you wanted to add, I think you had something on non-levy revenues.
Sure. This portion and then content we continue to look at with Brian is a preliminary high-level view at how staff and I have done with drafting a 2025 budget. That budget itself, throughout the last, I would say interactively, last week and a half, we've come to understand a lot of these other revenues that are important, valid steps in the budgeting process that help us back into that levy need. What can't we pay for on our own and have to ask taxpayers for? Our team was able to make significant changes to draft budgets in a way that reduced the deficit. Not to frighten anyone, but we were close to $252,000 at one point when we were workshopping. And we've strategically moved the needle down to 42. 42 is more or less a amount of money that I already have other identifiable ways to solve for. But to be candid with you all, they're temporary sources of revenue. One that we've already taken the liberty of adding in and solving for is temporary or interest on temporary investments. It's a form of revenue I was hoping to get out of the general fund in this budget cycle just because it is reliant upon the state of the economy and isn't a continued and reliable form of revenue. So therefore, if we're budgeting to it and we're doing great in the years where we're seeing 3s, 4s, and 5s, but at some point we take a turn downward, we now have to go to the taxpayer for more money because we were otherwise counting our chickens sometimes before they were even there and or hatching. $42,000, I can provide you a revenue in the form of the county is willing to come forward in a second year with fire and EMS, sort of a secondary offset. It's a temporary form of money, and we did approve a resolution this year accepting funds to the tune of around $70,000. And so this 42, as you're thinking through that math, becomes offset because I haven't until recently gotten anything in writing from the county committing to that type of a revenue being dispersed to us next year. I didn't want to overestimate or overinflate any sort of figures for you all. There are also a couple other things you need to know are assumed in this 42,000. We're assuming that as of last night, the town of Germantown has accepted a proposal from the fire department that brings every contributing agency's amount down to what was otherwise a higher ask or need from the village. We're also assuming that the Boys and Girls Club of Washington County is amenable and will confirm an increase in their contracted use going from $10,000 to $30,000 a year to the Park and Rec program. There's probably a couple other revenues I'm missing that the team could just call me out and tell me about. But if not, I'm going to pivot over to expenses that we moved, one of which is hiring a new police officer for the police department. What we're going to go ahead and assume is that if we post it even earlier in the year, we won't have a sworn officer that soon to have to compensate and benefit. Therefore, that hiring or funding point we're assuming is actually closer to July 1st. Another item to be taken up tonight as well is the potential hiring of another firefighter paramedic, which we've also placed mid-year, both for financial reasons and just logistically. It's very difficult to get somebody that quickly, particularly a preliminary MPO certification with the agency right out the gate. So that's just a little bit of a tell behind what numbers you're seeing right now. I'll remind you all, this evening is the evening to continue absorbing what we have prepared for you all, and to tell staff time out. You are nowhere near where we would expect you all to be fine-tuning the budget. or this is good to understand, we like what we're seeing, make this small tweak, or we're concerned about, the inevitable, what we've said, Brian, there is no capital project levy in what is before you. We are exhausting our levy limit capacities to fund operations. And so what we'll keep talking about, I yield back to you like now, Brian, is what has gone into these numbers you're seeing tonight and how meaningful it is tonight to get that feedback. So by the October 15th budget workshop, we have a game plan that you can viably consider supporting for the 2025 budget.
So, and then the last thing on this slide is I'll mention again, so we've hit the allowable levy to our debt adjustment to meet the debt payment, but like last year, we can increase that and use that revenue for something else. So just to better explain that max allowable line E line, the 1.9 million and the 2.1 million, technically we could claim an additional 2.1 million of levy now. Tax bill, tax rate impact, not gonna flow, but understand that it doesn't mean that we can't increase our allowable higher. We just, if you remember last year, we talked about, we wanna think about it as our base, so we get an understanding of, we don't wanna rely on this abated line in perpetuity, but we should understand that it's there and available. The other thing that I'll identify there is, technically you've been claiming part of your, what we call abated debt, but it really shouldn't be thought of as abated. It's a hard point to convey, but you have the fire and EMS as a whole paying a portion of debt service that it's asked of several entities to pay into. Primarily, they're gonna pay in with their own levy. But right, this is actual debt service of the village. So you do have an easy argument every year to say, and last year, 71,474 of that was used as, part of the allowable to meet, if you think about, we levied 184 for capital. But you could be using that and you have a strong argument for it because it funds the fire department technically as debt service. We call it an abatement because there is other entities paying into it. So we do want to start that framework of just, this is the base, but no, you do have capacity for additional levy, so it's not, to be $42,000 short is good news as compared to, as we stated, the first iteration was much larger than that. So we have a significant amount of levy capacity there in terms of if we want to make that debt service adjustment. But this conversation yet discusses impact, which is probably the most imperative part of this discussion, which is on the next slide. So based off of the projected, I'm going to repeat that, projected assessed valuation, if you remember, the final numbers come at the end of October or early November like they did last year. I believe that was delivered on November 2nd of last year. We get the final valuation, and mainly we're waiting on the state assessment for manufacturing. The impact off the levy need, so the $5,964,000 from the budget as it stands here tonight is a tax rate of $5.34. You will note that is a lower tax rate because once again, like in 21, we've gone through the revaluation process. That lower tax rate does not automatically mean a lower tax bill. Again, we're basing this off of the projected assessments. We know all of the other assessments, but there's certainly an opportunity where the manufacturing brings this assessed value up. But that said, we have lowered the tax rate because of a reval. But if you look at this sample property, again, a real property within the village, their valuation went up to $402,800. And so all other things being equal, based off of this projected assessed valuation. It's about an 8% increase to the tax bill, just as it stands now. There's going to be additional assessment as we get that manufacturing number. So I would hope that not only brings the tax rate down, of course, that would therefore then bring the tax bill down, because it doesn't mean that they're getting a partial assessment, you know, this residential property. My point in showing this, though, is the revaluation pressure on the residential class in the current economic environment, they are carrying the weight of your village-wide assessment gap. It's very important to realize, because this is going to be one of the most important budgets that this village is completing, given, I think, a lot of what you're going to see in terms of reval. I don't know how Board of Review, you know, if any issues were there or whatever, where we're at with that. But the tax bills is probably one that we'll start to see, you know, in any phone calls. So again, I do want to caveat, this is based off of the projected assessed valuation, which does have that manufacturing, I would say, partially removed. So I would say this is pretty conservative. I would hope this goes up, but I don't want to project something higher than it would be, because that would be a worse discussion later on in October. So everybody kind of understand how this is built. Again, the interplay of its levy, its total assessed value TID out, that develops a tax rate, and then there's a tax bill developed on an individual assessment. Okay.
And these are values that Brian's providing us now, and we're going to be keeping in mind during the October 15th budget workshop. So while some numbers we have a firmer understanding of the first week of November, we're workshopping October 15th, and we're taking a budgeting public hearing to the community, I want to say November 12th. And so within that pocket of time is when we really become more sure. And that is exactly the same as the schedule that we carried forward last year. I just don't want it to surprise anybody throughout this year's process as well.
So then on the next slide, while that represents a 7.9 increase, and you can say, well, that's all impacted by just the budget request, you know, that we have, or this initial draft budget. That's actually not true. So if you were to just build the same numbers and say we levied the exact same amount that we did last year, you recalculate that, the tax bill change with a flat levy is already 4.71. Again, based off of the project assessed value, which I do think will be higher. And so there's a portion of this, all other things being equal, that is just due to the revaluation, and we're only showing the impact on the residential class. You know, commercial properties and others carrying less of the assessment to fair market gap are probably going to see, you know, benefits as compared to thinking about how much theirs is going up versus a residential property. So those are just things to kind of consider there. But does that make sense, that if you truly net out kind of all other things being equal, just the impact of the reval and an assessment change on a residential property, in truth, the draft budget is really asking for a 3% tax bill change. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So some takeaways. Think about, as you go into your budget workshops, you know, what's the changes that we're making, right, to kind of meet allowable levy, whether that's, you know, increase in the allowable levy through the debt service adjustment, other non-levy revenues available, and or cuts. Again, I'm going to imagine it's, you know, a mixture of the whole thing, but that's basically where we start to reevaluate. What I would identify there is, again, the value of using us for this FMP process is, hey, we had a budget workshop, here are the 3 scenarios, go do your thing in a back room, Brian and Ariana. You know, we'll work on the what if scenarios. You just need to communicate that through us, either tonight or in future budget workshops. We're not worried about tax rate this year, in a sense, only to say we're more focused on tax bill rate. And I hope that makes sense, because we can all high five out of here that the tax rate is going down. But I think if we understand how the revaluation is working within the context of the current environment and impact on the majority of the properties by quantity, meaning number of properties, being the residential class, we do want to focus on kind of tax bill impact in my mind. But tax rate obviously interplays with that ultimately, but the whole point is, you know, are there initial tax bill goals? I think the board last year did a really good job of giving direction to both staff and others as to what we wanted to see going into, you know, future workshops. That really helped us make, you know, effective analysis for you guys to make positive decisions. So if you want to provide any direction at this time, we've kind of done our orange box like we did last year of, do we have any tax bill goals in mind, now understanding a little bit more of where the numbers shake out.
I just have a question, I guess, going to the capital fund or capital improvements, that we aren't budgeting for anything to go into that. How common is that among municipalities?
Quite common in bad net new construction years. Thoroughly uncommon if you think about what's actually you know, you have other operational needs in terms of new hires that are happening that are kind of taking the net new construction, and that's probably received with negative connotation. So I'd need to choose better words with that. But if you understand, you have the new salaries or other expenses, non-capital related, that are taking that net new construction, that 173, 220, whatever it is, which is a good thing because you have increased services. But understand that, right, you generally see more capital in a year when you do have net new construction. But the other element there is you also see communities use it for new salary positions when they do get quite a big jump. Most communities we work with levy something for capital because issuing debt, right, adds interest costs. So we don't see a ton of communities have it the majority of their budget. It's probably less than 10%, but it's something. So I think it's always, every budget is different, so it's a hard answer to give, yeah.
So us being in a robust net new construction year, to me, is a little bit concerning that we do have that net new construction bump this year, and we're still not able to budget anything for capital projects.
You're able to. We're just showing kind of the minimum allowable levy. You still had about $500,000 that you could add to this budget, but there would be tax bill implications.
So leads us to our orange box.
Yeah.
I think to expand and give the board a little bit more of a history reminder is, while we're interactively talking about this adjustment that's allowed, in former administration, there has been a more routine use of that adjustment. I wasn't with you in drafting and executing the 2020 budget, but I was with our auditors. And they do recognize moments in time when the approved levy to fund the village's operations is in excess of the allowable levy limit. And there have been every iteration of our village budget, at least I can speak to 2020, has utilized some of that adjustment. But I can also confirm that that adjustment itself that's made is not made to pay for operations. It was made to pay in cash for capital project items. And so if you're asking, well, are we setting a new precedent by continuing along this path? You're not. But the difference now is you are in that decision-making role in a more intentional way. Whereas previously, it may not have been articulated the way it is right now to those, either you're still here or now you're in the seats of those that were approving those budgets then.
And to amplify that, you don't want to use it for operations because as the debt amortizes, it's no longer available to you. Also, it doesn't go into your base levy, it's subtracted out each year. So if you remember the formula box for net new construction, it's what you did last year net of debt. So they'll subtract your claim. So what actually is very common, unfortunately, in communities that aren't growing, is they're using this adjustment to fund salaried positions, which is actually quite common, unfortunately. So they kind of have, well, we have this runway. We'll keep figuring out if we extend the runway or not and see how this goes. But the point of showing not using it in the initial draft is, do we have a real big uh-oh of we don't have any base capacity left over, which we're not in that position, so.
So I guess any comments from the board as to input on what kind of tax bill implications, is that the right word, that we would be looking for?
The concern I have is that we're paying for the new positions that we need, okay, with money that we have this year that we won't have next year. And because unless we continue to have expansion, which we will, we're still building houses. But what we have to keep in mind is we could get ourselves backed into a corner where all of a sudden we'll have to raise because we can't pay for the new positions that we need with funds that we didn't get through the tax levy. With that said, I don't want to raise taxes, but we could back ourselves in that corner a few years down the road. That's the only question. Does that make sense or not?
I look at the positions that we're talking about as core positions, and I said this in other meetings, that these are life altering, could be to some people that these positions are for, that we're filling. My core services are police, fire, rescue, then my sewer, water, I need those to live, then the streets need to be plowed, then it's the nice to haves, parks, rec, stuff like that, it's the nice to haves. If I can fund that, great, if not, maybe the following year I could do something. I got a core services, and I know at some point we have to hire another DPW employee and buy a new truck, because we have to have another plow route that's coming up, could be a couple of years down the road, could be less than that, I don't know. For sure by 2030, when we take all the other townships stuff in. I don't want to raise taxes either, but I look at these numbers are probably not going to be 100% either, but 150 some bucks to get me a paramedic, firefighter, and another police officer. I mean, this for the village's side, if that's right. I personally can do it, but the way the economy's going and the way everything else is going with the world right now in our country, hopefully things will change. After this election, to help people out. I mean, it's, and that's bring up a bad subject. That's why I didn't vote for the rec department expansion, because that's a lot of money we could be using for something else that didn't need to be done at the present time. So, it's already done, so we're here now. But yeah, it's just my thoughts.
Anyone else?
It may be helpful to just add that we do have that capital projects list we reviewed last workshop, and staff have examined priorities that we would really like to see certain items come through next year. Keep in mind, though, that what we're levying for capital projects is just that. It may not be the only form of revenue that we can utilize for acquisition of items. We do have a TID, one final year of a TID 4 payment back to the general fund for its obligations owed back. So that's an amount of money we can utilize. This is the last budget. We'll be applying some of that money, but this isn't an all or nothing conversation. It is, however, a conversation that we should have. And if the board's interested in understanding, like Brian has said, a scenario where last year we utilized a percentage. If you'd like to see tax bill impact on an amount, to be more exact, the ladder truck payment is one payment that's around 71,000, something, round up to 72. Maybe we could rely upon that as one simple metric or exercise to come back and show you what that tax bill impact could be when we're talking about actual projects in our workshop on the 15th. That's just one idea. You certainly don't have to go there to staff, but I wanted to try and offer something as a directional option.
If we've got nothing right now for capital in the budget, that's my understanding.
In the levy, meaning we can still pursue projects,
Okay.
but in terms of levying to offset either debt or to not delay other projects that won't otherwise be funded. And my understanding right now is we may be fine for 2025 projects that we've prioritized when it comes to utilization of another year of that TID4 money owed.
So I bring that up in the fact that we could revisit what we have in the capital plan as far as moving things around, because right now there's some significant dollars in what Brian says is optional, and I agree with that, that are things to be projected in the future that we've already invested some money in, but that we don't have to pull the trigger and spend a couple $1 million more right now, for example, things coming up.
Sure. Yep.
That's all.
What, I know there's a lot of building and stuff going on, but do we have a feel for why our net new construction was so robust?
I think one really banner year project we can look at or reference is the Cisco expansion. When we see a 4%, 4.16% net new construction, and I did have it in my mind what value that particular number carried, and it's escaped me, of course, now. But one item I can point to is that $90 million Cisco expansion. While that's the investment rate, we know there's a little bit of a discount. Manufacturing can assess 80 cents on the dollar generally. I've seen in the assessment year history that probably half of what they've spent hit the assessment rolls as of 1/1. Their property valued from 21 million to 60 million between 23 and 24. I'm expecting of that 60, maybe we'll see another 30 million, meaning about 70 out of 90.
Maybe.
Not
Brian
conservative
thinks
enough.
you're too optimistic.
Let's imagine, where's the John Deere plant? Is that Horicon? They spent 120 million, and that was assessed at I think 50 or 40. So
Million?
yeah, you
So
gotta.
it's not an 80% discount.
Yeah, it's
80 cents on the dollar.
it kind of depends, and again, that's where it's like we always joke in our office. The state manufacturing assessment is this black hole of how do we feel today? I don't know, because we have seen a lot assess at 80%. It almost seems like the bigger the project, the less it gets, and I'm now going outside of my professional expertise and only speaking anecdotally. So, yeah.
Then the secondary reason that I believe that we will see another net new construction is actually primarily the residential growth we've experienced. The number of permits that we're issuing, the number of public roads we're potentially accepting, and letters of credit we're releasing upon construction progress leads me to believe we're not going to see a 0.52% net new construction, at least not in the next budgetary cycle. And that's actually why, as we move on to the second phase after the staff seek direction we so humbly ask for tonight in the 2025 draft, is we've actually elevated to 1.5% net new construction because it takes that 5-year look back into account and projects forward still conservatively. So I yield back to you.
Thank you.
What do you, in the banking industry, obviously the interest went down half a point, which is a bunch. What do you see as far as people still looking to buy anything as far as?
Yeah, I mean, it's still active. I mean, mortgage rates are down a little bit, but you're never gonna get to that 3% again. That'll really fuel the, but I mean, I think there's more building going on now because of demand. The demand is so high, that's what's driving it. People really don't care what the rates are, amazingly, but it's just the demand.
Speaking of rates, is there a way to refinance any of our loans if the rates drop at all?
So,
Save money?
yeah, we look at that quarterly, and then for the village on an automatic basis. And then anytime that we see market drops, we assess that at point in time as well. So the Fed cutting rates doesn't automatically mean there's a one-to-one drop in the municipal bond market. We would expect to see something. However, there could be a lot of supply as well. So therefore, the underwriters now have a little bit more control, right? So we'll see what happens. The other thing that we typically see in an election year, just like the news and how much fun that is, the interest rates go like this, you know, with what's coming out, who's going to win, everything like that. So I, can provide a similar chart, but another community was curious as to, can you isolate election years? And actually COVID was less volatile, the 2020 election, because the interest rates were so low, right? There's so much volatility you can have when you're at zero. But the 2016 election was kind of one of the wilder yield curves and just resulting sale results that you would see. So I'm gonna say it's gonna be hard to predict. We do keep on top of it.
What other options would we have for what we want to see on the tax bill, other than what you have in here that's projected already? I mean, we can't just pull a number out of the air and say, hey, if we want an estimated increase of $200, what does that do to the budget?
I would do it on a percentage basis, because that's, we would hit all, properties at that point, right? $200 would just be isolated for the sample property.
Yep.
And so their individual assessments may change depending on how that revaluation happened. It looked like it's going to not just be flat for everybody, based off of me clicking on a few properties, but I think picking a percentage basis like was done last year, we landed right on
3.
So.
Any feedback from the board as to what we would like them to work up and bring back?
I'll throw out a 5% instead of 7.9.
Oh, make cuts.
We're still going from 3 to 5.
Can I ask a question? Because I think it should be stated. Would that apply if we had the opportunity to levy as well? Meaning, let's say the state assessment comes in, so we have a higher assessed value, right? And if it's 5%, does that now, and we have the room within that 5% to then levy for capital? Because that was the direction gave is 3%, and we see what the results are. So we actually, I think the number was 167 for capital with 3% until we got the state manufacturing. And so we actually increase it and then.
Didn't it end up like 3 something? Or am I off on that? I don't remember.
But what I'm saying is last year, we had the latitude both directions. So that's, I think we should be clear on that, is if we're okay with 5%, if that means we're allowed to levy, show that, and I'm not making the decision for you, I'm saying to show that in that manner, or is it, I would say, make sure we understand it's projected assessed value right now. I don't have the final assessment number.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not saying the 5% is set in concrete. It's a goal, somewhere get between where we're at and where we were last
Sure.
year, somewhere in there.
A 5.
Yep.
How we get there, that's fine.
Okay.
Is that your number? Going from a 4.7 to a 5, John?
Yeah, we're pretty close.
Okay.
John, I think when you talk about 2019-20 budget, when you just kind of were taking over, and in the past, we were borrowing money for, loans and stuff like that. We got away from that years ago and started levying for that, but I looked at, this is numbers that he gave us, you know, back in 1920, where it was 799 for the tax rate, which really doesn't mean much, but the assessed value, there was no reassessment for those 2 years, so it wasn't like people were getting double banged,
Sure.
you know, a bill where, you know, we're gonna add more to that, and then all of a sudden their house rates were, you know, was assessed more like it was in 21. Even though the rate went down a little bit, but that's still, tax bill still went up, you know, by, I don't know, about 150 bucks or more from the previous year, but it seemed like a lot of money, but nowadays with everything that's going on in this, you know, it's, sometimes it's people's food and gas money for the weekend, you know, so.
Plus we're gonna be charging more for water and sewer as well.
So,
We have a 5% idea on the floor,
okay,
which is a step up from the right now 4.71 impact, 4.71 increase based on slide 16, Brian?
think he's saying
Total, yep, so it's a 0.29% jump from what utilizing all of our levy right now does to the taxpayer.
What I'm understanding is, so percentage is actually gonna be slide 15. if
Yeah.
you don't mind. Yeah, and then kind of saying that's, so it would actually be cutting down to whatever gets,
Oh, so, okay, it is cutting the budget.
yeah, that's what 5%.
It is not
All other things.
levying capital.
But that's where I'm saying, understanding the purple number is gonna change not only the levy need, we should respect that. If we're, are we showing it, when we get that final assessment? Is there wiggle room that way as well, like we're okay with 5%? What happened last year is there was 3%, and under the projected amount, I had that at, what, 167 for the capital levy. It turned into 184 because your state manufacturing assessment number was higher than our assessed value that we had in there. So if that makes sense, right, you would get actually wiggle room in that scenario to actually probably levy more than what we're showing. So I just, like, it's more, what are we comfortable with, and we'll come back with the, you know, impact. But if we're comfortable with 5, that's a clear direction to me, but it goes both, it may not be cut if our assessed value is higher, right?
But this is a lot of uncertainty, just to speak to the staff that may have to further cut and not exhaust the levy allowance and then not utilize our full levying capacity. We're then diminishing the floor for the following fiscal year, where we're allowed to then, our base is reduced in 2026. If the valuation doesn't come in higher to offset what is right now a 7.9% increase to the taxpayer.
Even if the valuation comes in higher, didn't we have someone protest last year and take it back down a little bit? One of the larger manufacturing places in town.
We do have a routine objection that's filed with the state manufacturing assessment, but I can't speak right now to where we're heading. I can only singularly think of right now about what I need to go back and cut in the budget, and so that's why I'm looking at Brian Raymer to really better understand where 5% will take us from an operational standpoint.
You actually wouldn't reduce the base. It would be a reduction of the claim for debt. So you're using base levy to pay for your debt service. It is a cut to the operational funds to get to the total levy need. When you're filling out the worksheet, if, I don't know where it lands, and again, we wanna explore the options and get that direction, but it would be reducing the claim and the debt service line, so there wouldn't be technically a base loss there.
Okay.
But it's just understanding kind of where we feel like, again, I would say is understanding that the revaluation may eat up 4% just on its own, right? That's very small wiggle room for staff if all other things are equal here and there is no increase from the manufacturing assessment. So I think that's the message Jen's trying to convey, is that could be a pretty significant cut to the operating budgets.
Why don't we do like Tim said, why don't we get a list of the capital projects that you're looking at, that everyone's looking at for next year, so we can look at those and see if something has to be done next year or if it can be put off a year. That way, if we do pick things under that need to be done, we can see how much money we need and then look at it that way, instead of just, see what we want to fund, instead of either coming up short or, whatever we're looking at doing. At least look at a list of stuff that.
I would say capital projects would not even be on the table to levy for, because a 5% tax bill impact means we have to go back to the drafted budget that we've cut $252,000 out of and cut more. I'm trying to apply,
Yeah.
there wouldn't be any.
Changing the capital projects
Yeah.
won't change the tax bill this year. Yep.
John, can I just ask you for a clarification of what you're asking them to do? So you're not saying that ultimately you would want to see the budget taken from the 7.9 to well, ultimately, I guess we would, but
It's a challenge point.
it's an exercise to see what sort of
Yes.
impact
Yes.
it has on
Yes.
the budget.
I know budgets are gonna go up. There's nothing to do about it. And if we don't go up, we're gonna get behind every year. But I wanna make sure that the budget that comes out is as feasible to the taxpayer as possible. I mean, you're looking at high inflation right now, you're looking at groceries prices that are through that hopefully maybe next year that some of that stuff is gonna come down, that the higher budget could go up next year. I know it's pushing it down the road a little bit, but you gotta look at the world outside, what's going on too, with costs of everything, and try to fit in there, is my point.
So I'm gonna play devil's advocate. And I'm assuming these are just numbers you pop into your spreadsheets and it populates a lot of the stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. So John's taken the 5%. I would like to see 9% to see what that would do to like what we could put in the capital from that.
right.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying that's what the final end result is gonna be. I'd just like to see the numbers as what impact it would
We
be.
had like 3 different numbers that
Right.
we looked at.
Yeah.
Right.
I think there was flat 3 and something else. I forget what. I'm gonna zip through. Yeah, so, any other thoughts on, I think we have a range that'll help. It'll give a dollar amount, staff, and think about how we navigate that, beyond that point.
I just wanted to make a point that I'm a little bit more toward the John side of things. We don't know what the other taxing jurisdictions are going to do as well, and I think we have to look at the big enough picture for our residents, that what is that going to do? I understand that, we have to look at ourselves, but if everybody is going up the same rate as we are, that can be a pretty big hit to the residents who have to then pay the extra bill for everybody. So I think it slants, to me, it feels like we slant more toward the lower end and try to address the issues without just simply saying, oh, let's just blow everything out of the water because we don't know what the other jurisdictions are gonna do. They're all living in the same environment as we are, higher wages and higher costs and, you know, all that kind of thing. So they're all living in the same environment as we are.
I agree with you, Randy. Me personally, I'm more leaning towards the John side. I just wanted the bigger number for just as a what if.
Yeah, and I think too, as it relates, what that ultimately yields towards the budget workshops is we can give a flat dollar amount as to what that means. If that equates to around one new salaried position, like cutting to 5% means that salaried position, then that's, I think, a guiding post for that discussion in my mind. I don't know if, I'm just saying if that's how it's gonna be, so I think that's how I would kind of take this, and we'll show that range, and you'll now have kind of three scenarios, if you will. So that said, I'll kind of go, any other comments on tax bill?
The only other comment I got is right now we're not considering any capital and expenditures. I'd like to have staff also, what they consider an expenditure that we cannot push off a year, that it's definitely needed in 2025, and see where that affects the budget also. Not something it's really nice to have, but something we definitely need because it's gonna fall apart next year and we're not gonna have it.
And that wouldn't impact the tax bill, because right now we're not levying, but I know the prioritization is part of your budget process.
Right.
So congruent to this discussion. Just wanna make sure we know. Cutting a capital project next year will not lower this.
Right.
Yep, okay. So then I'll go, I apologize, we were jumping around. Slide 18 and beyond. Yep. So the reason we do this then is on kind of slide 19, but more or less, we wanna put some financial pressure tests on future budgets to kind of get through this representation. The other thing is we have additional salaried positions added within the planning period beyond 25. Deputy treasurer, do I have that right? The public works, yep, and paramedic? Yep. So we can evaluate what those future budgets look like, as well as inject some reasonable expectation for trend valuation of line item expenditures. So not only have a linear analysis, but onboarding new staff as well. And then again, we're gonna weigh that against a pretty significant stress test. So if you don't mind advancing. So these are the linear trends that we've applied to the line item budgets, which again, this is the high level discussion, and you'll kind of speak to line item budgets throughout your internal budget workshops. But these, you know, we apply cost definitions to certain categories of expenses and then apply, you know, a linear trend to those beyond that point. The only change from last year is we had 3.5 for wages in this exercise this year. So building the 26 budget and beyond, we have a 3%. Everything else has remained the same.
Jen, speaking of wages, is, well, obviously not done, but with the negotiation with the police department, is that number what we were talking about factored in here?
It's actually not. I know we've exchanged proposals in closed session, so I won't go into any sort of details in open session. But we do have to keep in mind that when you're working through collective bargaining, that there are times when a group of employees will be compensated differently. That 3% is a placeholder, but we're hopeful that negotiations will be completed soon, and we'll have more information shortly.
So then we take those expenditure codes to build a future levy need beyond the 2025 budget year, which is the first column of numbers that you're seeing. And then we kind of project out the next 5 budget years. The stress test that we're applying is saying, what if our allowable increase is only 0.5%, and that's a pretty significant discount of your 5-year average. So your 2009 to 2024 average has been about 2%. The minimum, though, is that 0.5%. So it's basically saying, what if year over year we have that 5% net new construction? What kind of pressure does that put on? The benefit of doing that, because that's likely not going to happen, right? That's the worst year, and we're projecting the worst year every year for this. But the reason that we do that is to identify when we do have increases in expenditures, whether it's debt service, new employees, et cetera. But here, for example, budget year 2027, that would be a bad year to have a 0.5% of net new construction based off of all other things being equal. That's the point of this analysis. The other element that this analysis would do is, if we had a bad year of net new construction, do we have an opportunity to meet our needs? Throughout this, that answer is yes. Again, through that allowable debt service adjustment, not even looking at what the impact to tax rate or tax bill, but it's putting a stress test on building the future budgets for 5 years. What would be, the worst year, if you will, and then do we have the capacity if let's say the worst thing happened, we've, hired these people and now we have this issue, do we still have the capacity to take care of it? So in my mind, 27, and beyond are probably what would be the harder years as it relates to a low net new construction year against the projected levy need. Primarily, you can kind of see they're driven by increases in general fund as well as debt service as it relates to the allowable levy. Now, debt service is a 1-to-1, so in truth, that's the years in which we have a series of hires that are hitting and increasing the general fund the most. So just kind of ways to think about municipal budgeting in advance and the navigable routes we may have for future budgets as necessary. That said, you would have the levy authority to meet that deficiency each year, no different than the 42,000 this year.
One comment I hate to go back to the net new construction all the time, but I mean, right now we have a lot of construction going on. But if I look at our borders and boundaries that the village currently has, we are encroaching on the end of our limits at this point. So these robust net new constructions, assuming there is no additional development or annexation that would come into the village, that 2% net new construction could be a high number. Just to keep that in mind. We're experiencing large growth right now, but it could very well go down below that 2%.
The next annexation is in 2030, isn't it?
Well, that's attachment. I'm talking about,
Yes.
I'm talking about expansion out.
Right.
That's a whole different bear up there.
Does that give us any more growth potential at that point, other than that?
What you're allowed to do is make a one-time adjustment based upon the town's mill rate for the value of that property, which ultimately does not financially provide too much of an opportunity for the
Correct.
village. It's a very it's a lot more money to serve those properties than what actually comes in.
That's not on the chart though. You know, that's,
Right.
that's the next
That's
year.
beyond, yeah.
21,
And this is by 1 year. Yeah.
right?
Value year
Not
26.
intentional.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
5-year.
Yeah.
Well, I guess to rephrase the question, when those properties are annexed, okay, or that area is annexed, take the case of the Twin Creeks area, you had the Maple Fields going in and everything, so there's more expansion beyond what you annexed, okay? So when you annex that area in 2030, is there more potential for growth in construction in that area?
No, because it's all built out
Okay.
for the most part.
In order,
Valleywood might have some expansion area, but I mean, Appalachian Ridge is pretty much all built out.
That's correct, unless, you know, you have 32 lots with Valleywood.
Right.
Unless that gets redeveloped, that was
Right.
205 lots, and you are correct. I mean, that's when we started, the administrator and I started talking 2 years ago to a certain developer of looking at what's the new TID district or what's the new industrial park. And that's something that the village should enter into if you want to, because you're starting to, that's expanding out. You know, your next one might be the corridor along P
Right,
would be to look at.
right.
we also,
You are correct. I mean, unless something gets annexed in, you know, north, we do have it in the water, you know, the impact fee to go north on Jackson Drive and make the loop going down Pleasant Valley. But I mean, a lot of the farmers around here want top dollar, and you know, it's hard to develop. So that's why you got next generation housing.
Right.
So then,
But the doomsday.
no. This, but it's important to understand, cause you have to react quickly and you'd rather know, ahead of time. So then looking at the projected summary tax levy and then tax rate. So instead of providing the, you know, bigger blue numerical chart, we've graphed it out here in terms of what those projected levy needs would do for the future years. So you basically have the drop from 20 for your 25 budget as a result of the reval, and then slight increases beyond that point. We do project another reval only based off the fact that it goes below 75%. That's kind of assuming a similar housing market condition and the divergence between assessment to fair market. So that might be a little aggressive as well. I would imagine you're probably looking at you know, a 3 to 4 year window again there, but that's why you see a tax rate drop. It has nothing to do with the levy need. It's only projecting out a potential new reval. So again, these are just kind of planning mechanisms to have in place. You know, 3 new hires beyond this budget, this 2025 budget. What does this look like? What are some of the financial pressures in a bad net new construction year? So really no navigable decision as it relates to these numbers, just to kind of shed some light on future municipal budgeting. And then I handed out an individual slide here, because I had, I was connecting to the wrong year for the net new construction. So this is showing for this is now budget year on top, which is a little different because expenditure restraint just works that way. You have your budget year and then you have a payment year. So the only thing that we're representing intentionally on this slide is kind of, is the current budget falling within expenditure restraint? Because if it's not, then we lose shared revenue. So the answer is yes, the 25 budget falls within constraint. Don't pay attention to what's on screen, that never existed. My Excel workbook was perfect. Just kidding. From time to time, there's bad linkage. So beyond that though, if we were to assume 0.5 net new construction, now that can hurt you on the back end as well. meaning that if we do need these new hires and that all kind of culminates in 27, that a 0.5 net new construction would not keep up with that under the expenditure restraint qualification. That'll be analyzed more closely as we get to next year and we start to project out CPI a little more acutely. Right now, we've held it flat for what this year's is. The state just actually established it today, 0.1 higher than our projection, which was 3.1. So technically, you got a little more wiggle room as well. The last thing that I'll mention here is if you remember from last year, wherever you end up landing in your final budget, given if it's below their ceiling, we're going to recommend an added contingency line item to beef the expenditures only to make sure you keep capping your ceiling. Because if you don't do so and you have a bad net new construction year, that can go away quickly. So we talked about this at length last year. We actually increased it above for basically prepaying or pre-qualifying for the new officer. So that was something great to do because as you can see here, the gap isn't that large. Sorry, I gotta look at the actual sheet. It's about a 0.4% difference. So had we not done that, I would guarantee we're not qualifying for expenditure restraint. So something that you're gonna continually do. I'm just gonna say we kind of inject that into the last budget model. One other thing is actually some communities will make a budget amendment because technically this isn't due, the expenditure restraint form isn't due till May of the next year. So I have a lot of communities I work with, they're like, can you just come back in March and just tell us what this contingency number is gonna be and we'll amend our budget to that. Just make everybody feel happy that the contingencies, you know, an extra explanation that we have to make upon adopting the budget. So two different options there. Last year we did it with the main budget, if you will, or the original adopted budget. The next two slides are reference of what fund balance is, how it's categorized, and explaining that. I'm not going to walk through that one by one. We talked about that last year, the reason for fund balance and why we use it. Essentially, you want that in order to make sure you have emergency funds available and opportunities to downsize debt service in bad interest rate environments. So we can all understand within our own personal budgets, I'm sure, why it's important to have cash in the bank. Same goes for municipal budgeting. And then the last slide is an evaluation on where the general fund balance has been and then where it would go. The one element to that is understand that one, we have the breakout of non-spendable to unassigned, purple being unassigned. The lines are kind of the limitations in terms of the orange and the dark orange. I don't even know how to describe that color, maybe maroon. And then the blue is the actual and projected. The one point that you'll note if you see it going down is only because we're showing it as a percentage of revenues. And think about how the model works is we're projecting balanced budgets each year, so there's no change in general fund. You know, the budget or the fund balance wouldn't go up or it wouldn't go down, but the revenues would go up, right? So there's kind of like, it looks bad projecting out. The only point being is you've done an effective job of budgeting historically, so I do want to focus on 24 and earlier. If you see that go up, that means, you know, we have good effective budgets and we're hitting actuals that are under it, so we're deriving surplus, and then we can decide what to do with that thereafter. One thing I would mention there is the policy is anything over 75%, you have to do something with it, and then your minimum is 35%, is that correct? I just got a lot of numbers in my head. The one element that I'd say there is generally you've been above this as well, is Moody's has kind of said 45% is what they like of late. The median for single A, and you're better than that, is 40%. So if I were to think about a minimum in my mind, 40% may be more reasonable. And the other element is, as we go back into the capital discussion through October, is you may have more room then to reallocate some of the general fund balance or find that suitable for use to, one, fund capital projects, because we got a lot of them coming up, fund, current or projected budgets as well. The thing there is right now the policy really only directs the board if it's over 75 and then just says, just so you know, we have a minimum of 35. It doesn't say what you do in between. So just to provide some context there. But I would focus on 24 and earlier more on this chart. And that staff has been doing a good job meeting budget to actuals there. So that's all I got.
Do you need any other direction from us tonight, or do you have what you need?
That
Go get Jen a
that
pencil
question not
sharpener.
only goes to me, it goes to Jen as well. Are you looking for anything else?
Well, I think we've gotten the give the options to us direction from the board. Now it's up to us to decide if that means cutting, removing the hiring of positions next year, if that meets that threshold, that lowest threshold, I would say. If not, we'll move on to cutting in other ways. But ultimately, I also understand that cutting what's cash instead of ongoing operational isn't really the big picture, it's the quick win. So if I wanted to say, well, we'll show you a budget to meet this parameter, if we're looking for a 1-year pause on something like we added $100,000 in cash to offset future debt payments of the fire department. That was something we were able to fit in last year that we wanted to continue doing because we knew it would offset principal and interest payments for the future. But that's the first place my mind goes, guys, is, well, if we really do need to cut again, we're going to look in places where we don't have to have the money sitting there and paid for right now. But I would urge the board in the next year to bring it back if we can. This is really more, as I'm putting together the feedback you've given me, is this is not the year, Jen, for the team to keep some of those nice to have things. And it may be worthy of reconsidering in another budget cycle when the economy maybe acts a little differently to our taxpayers. And if what I've summarized to you all is appropriate, I think as your administrator, I do feel a bit more comfortable if we know that that is what the end goal could be for what you represent, which is our electors and our taxpayers.
Any last comments? John, you have anything?
She's on the right track.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Item number 5 on the agenda is a consent agenda. We have 4 items on there this evening. Anyone seen any reason to pull anything out and take it separately? If not, I would look for a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
We have a motion by Wells, second by Engelhardt. The only, any discussion on any of these items? The only thing I'm going to say is I just wanted to make a comment on item 5C. So just wanted to thank Jackie and her staff for taking the extra time to provide those extra hours for the voters to come in and do their in-person absentee ballot or voting. I think it's going to be probably a record-breaking election. So I think having those hours, a few hours at night till 6:30, and then that one Saturday is going to be a huge benefit. And did also want to, send a thanks out to Washington County because they are covering the costs of those additional hours and what it costs us to pay our people, and actually at a rate of 150% of what our actual cost is. So just wanted to say thank you, and hope everything runs smoothly in the coming months. Anything else on the consent agenda? All in favor by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Item 6. 6A, the final plat for Morning Meadow subdivision edition number 3, Home Pass Financial LP. This did come from Plan Commission with a recommendation to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve the final plat from Morning Meadow subdivision edition number 3 for Home Path Financial LP.
Second.
We have a motion by Emmerich, second by Wells. Any further discussion on this item?
Okay, I had, per staff comments on there, sorry, if there's any on there.
I'll still second.
Anything else? All in favor by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Item 6B is the final plat for Oaks of Jackson subdivision, edition number 1 for Hillcrest Jackson LLC. Again, this did come from Plan Commission with a recommendation to approve.
Make a motion to approve the final plat, Oaks of Jackson subdivision edition number 1, Hillcrest Jackson LLC, for any staff comments.
Second.
We have a motion by Emmerich, second by Wells. Any further discussion on this item? All in favor by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Item 7 is items coming from Personnel Committee. 7A is review and discussion of amendments to various sections of the Village of Jackson Employee Handbook and adoption of the revised Employee Handbook effective January 1, 2025. This did come from Personnel with a recommendation to approve.
Make a motion, we approve the presented material.
I'll second.
We have a motion by Engelhardt, second by Emmerich. Any further discussion on this item? All in favor by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Item number 7B is proposed staffing adjustments for the fire department. This did come from the Personnel Committee with a recommendation to direct staff to work it into the budget to provide another firefighter paramedic.
Would you like me to read?
Yeah, that would be good, because that was,
My notes from the meeting reflect the committee recommended that the full-time position not start until July 1st, 2025, and come back to the Personnel Committee for a final review and approval prior to being posted, not to go past March 31st. And that motion was made on the basis of anticipating a countywide fire EMS study report back by then. And in the event the study were to be delayed, we would not want to negatively impact the fire department's ability to proceed with the posting as staffing is needed. I yield back to you, Brian.
thank you. So that's the way it came from Personnel Committee. Now, whether we approve it that way tonight here or not, that is up to the board. So I guess I would be looking for a motion on that item.
I'll make a motion to approve a new hire full-time for 2025 for July without any stipulations.
I'll second that.
We have a motion by Wells, second by Emmerich. Any further discussion on this item? All in favor by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries. Item 8, motion to adjourn.
Adjourn.
Second.
Motion by Kripke, second by Emmerich to adjourn. All in favor by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
That was NA.
Yes.